The emergency guardianship petition was not handed to me as a family warning. It was taped quietly to my apartment door like a pre-written sentence. My mother, who claimed I merely fixed computers for the government, hired a psychiatrist to prove I was completely incompetent. She just did not know one crucial fact. The man she hired was my former commanding officer, the person who cleared me for classified programs my family lacked the clearance to even name. My name is Valerie Butler. I am 34 years old. The drive back to my apartment near Fort Halcyon in Virginia took exactly 45 minutes, but my mind was still tethered to the windowless sub-basement of the Raven Annex. I had just completed a grueling 72-hour shift. My veins hummed with residual adrenaline and far too much black coffee. The air inside the annex always tasted of recycled ozone and quiet desperation, a stark contrast to the crisp evening air outside. My job required me to exist in a state of hypervigilance, hunting anomalies in classified networks, intercepting threats before they could cripple emergency infrastructures. I was exhausted down to my marrow, but it was a clean, purposeful exhaustion. I pulled into my designated parking spot, killed the engine, and let the silence wash over me. I needed sleep. I needed a dark room and 12 solid hours of uninterrupted silence. I walked into my building, rode the elevator to the 4th floor, and approached my door. I bypassed the standard lock, disengaged the secondary deadbolt I had installed myself, and pushed the heavy door open. That was when the illusion of safety shattered. It was not a threat delivered with a gun or a broken window. It was a thick, heavy manila envelope taped firmly to the inside of my front door. Someone had bypassed the perimeter, convinced the building manager to grant them access, and left a legal bomb in my sanctuary. The stark white label glared at me in the dim light of the entryway. It was an emergency guardianship summons issued by the Red Clay County Court. A normal civilian might have screamed. A normal daughter might have dropped her bags, fallen to her knees, and wept at the sheer betrayal. But panic is a luxury you cannot afford when you spend your life managing cascading network failures where a single misstep costs lives. I did not panic. I reacted with the absolute, terrifying stillness of a woman who had been meticulously trained to never waste a single drop of emotion when the danger was real. I locked the door behind me. I set my tactical bag down on the kitchen island. I washed my hands, the warm water running over my knuckles, grounding me in the present reality. Then, I sat on the bar stool, broke the seal of the envelope, and pulled out the thick stack of legal filings. The petitioner listed on the very first page was my mother, Evelyn Butler. The words on the paper were clinical, polite, and thoroughly weaponized. Evelyn was formally petitioning the court to strip me of my autonomy. Her sworn affidavit accused me of suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, profound cognitive impairment, and escalating paranoid behavior. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a woman entirely detached from reality, a person utterly incapable of managing her own life, her health, or her finances. Attached to these medical accusations was the true objective, the beating heart of her legal strike. Evelyn had filed a motion to immediately freeze all my access to the trust fund and the controlling company shares I was slated to inherit from my late father. By law, those assets were meant to transfer to my sole control on my 35th birthday, which was exactly 42 days away. Evelyn was using the legal system to build a dam against that impending transfer. I reached into my bag and pulled my phone from its signal blocking pouch. I dialed a number I had memorized years ago. Owen Hale answered on the second ring. Owen was a former military defense attorney, a man whose mind was as sharp and unforgiving as a combat knife. He understood the vast, silent chasm between civilian anxiety and operational security. He stated his name briskly. I stared at the signature of the county judge on the first page. "She started it," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any tremble or hesitation. "Bring the entire file to my office right now," Owen replied, his tone shifting instantly from professional courtesy to tactical readiness. I grabbed my car keys, but I did not stop reading. As I paced the length of my living room, flipping through the meticulously numbered pages, the full scope of my mother's narrative revealed itself. Evelyn had submitted a character statement that read like a tragic Southern Gothic novel. She described me to the court as a deeply isolated, unstable woman living in a fantasy world. The most infuriating paragraph was how she characterized my career. I could not tell her the truth about the Raven Annex. I could not explain the clearances, the threat levels, or the encrypted communications. So, she filled that silence with her own poison. Evelyn told the court that my military work was a grand, pathetic fabrication. She claimed I invented a high-level government career to hide my personal failures and my inability to maintain a normal, respectable civilian life. Every security measure I took, from keeping my phone in a secure pouch to checking the sightlines of a room, she twisted into evidence of paranoid delusions. She turned my discipline into a disease. But the heaviest blow was not the accusation of insanity. It was the financial addendum buried near the back of the petition. Evelyn was not just asking the judge to pause the inheritance until I was evaluated. She was formally requesting the right to extend her management of the trust for another 10 full years. She wrote, with sickeningly sweet legal phrasing, that this extension was absolutely necessary for the safety and well-being of her deeply troubled daughter. She wanted to lock me in a financial cage for a decade, holding the only key, all while wearing the mask of a martyred, devoted mother trying to save her broken child. The sheer audacity of her plan was breathtaking. She was not trying to help me. She was trying to erase me legally, to turn me into a ghost who owned nothing and controlled nothing, all so she could maintain her grip on the family wealth. Every claim she made was a calculated lie built on the foundation of my necessary silence. I felt a cold rage settling in my chest, a heavy, solid thing taking root. I gathered the papers, aligning the edges perfectly. I reached the final section of the dossier, the expert witness designations. These were the medical professionals Evelyn had retained to evaluate my supposed condition and testify to my utter incompetence in a court of law. I expected to see a list of high-priced civilian therapists, doctors who worked in plush offices and wrote whatever narrative their wealthy clients paid them to write. My eyes scanned down to the very last page. The ambient hum of the refrigerator seemed to vanish. The breath hitched in my throat. The blood in my veins suddenly felt like ice water. The primary psychiatric expert my mother had hired to dismantle my life was Dr. Adrian Mercer. I stared at the letters of his name until they blurred. My mother thought she had found a brilliant, intimidating legal weapon. She thought she had hired a ruthless expert to stand on the witness stand and declare me legally insane. She had absolutely no idea who he really was. Adrian Mercer was no stranger pulled from a directory. He was the man who had seen me at my absolute breaking point. He was the man who had evaluated my psychological endurance, looked at my darkest edges, and cleared me for the very classified programs my family was not even authorized to know existed. I slid the papers back into the envelope. The war had officially come to my doorstep, but Evelyn had just handed me the one weapon she never saw coming. Growing up in Marston, Virginia taught me everything I needed to know about the tactical application of silence. Our house was a sprawling colonial structure with immaculate white pillars and a manicured lawn that looked like it was measured with a ruler. But inside those pristine walls, quiet was not a sign of peace. It was a metric. My mother used silence the way a warden uses a solitary confinement cell. If I was perfectly still, perfectly quiet, and perfectly agreeable, I was deemed a good daughter. The moment I expressed an unsanctioned opinion or displayed an emotion that did not fit the curated aesthetic of our household, the silence shifted. It became a heavy, suffocating blanket of disapproval. You did not get yelled at in our residence. You were simply erased until you learned how to behave. My father was the only variable in that tightly controlled environment. He was a man built of entirely different materials. He spent the first chapter of his life flying transport planes in combat zones, a military pilot who understood the chaos of the outside world. When he left the service, he channeled that specific brand of adrenaline into a civilian enterprise. He founded his own company, a boutique emergency logistics firm. It was technically a small family business, but it operated on a scale that commanded serious capital. His company specialized in moving critical supplies, medical equipment, and disaster relief resources when conventional supply chains collapsed. It was high stakes, high pressure, and highly lucrative. He built something with real, tangible value, forged from his own grit and an intimate understanding of how the world breaks down. While my father built a legacy of utility, my mother built a fortress of perception. Evelyn existed entirely for the image she projected into the world. Her domain was the Sunday morning church service, the endless stream of charity galas, and the fiercely competitive local women's clubs. She cultivated a persona of absolute perfection. To the outside observer, we were the ideal family, and she was the tireless, sacrificing matriarch who held it all together. Every dinner party anecdote, every holiday photograph, and every casual conversation at the grocery store was carefully engineered to reinforce her narrative. She played the role of a woman burdened by the heavy responsibility of raising children and supporting a busy husband, wearing her supposed sacrifices like a crown of thorns cast in solid gold. The illusion held until the day my father suffered a catastrophic brain hemorrhage. It was sudden, brutal, and entirely devoid of the dramatic buildup my mother usually preferred for her tragedies. He was simply there one morning and gone the next. When the call came, I was thousands of miles away, locked deep inside a secure facility during an active deployment. The parameters of my mission were absolute. I was holding the line on a critical network vulnerability, and leaving my station was not just professionally prohibited, it was physically impossible until the extraction window opened. The military does not pause operations for personal grief. I spent the first 48 hours after his death staring at glowing monitors, doing my job with a hollow, ringing emptiness echoing in my chest. By the time my command cleared me to travel, the funeral arrangements were already underway. I managed to secure a transport flight back to Virginia. Racing against the clock, I did not have time to return to my base housing. I did not have time to procure a respectful black dress or arrange my hair into a soft, mourning style. I arrived at the community church precisely as the service was beginning. I walked down the center aisle wearing my standard issue field uniform. The fabric was stiff. My boots were scuffed from the tarmac, and I carried the distinct, heavy presence of someone who had just stepped out of a war zone. I could feel the collective gaze of the congregation shifting away from the flower arrangements and settling onto me. I was not making a statement. I was simply a daughter trying to see her father one last time, wearing the only clothes I had available. Evelyn did not see a grieving daughter. She saw a catastrophic breach of protocol. Before I could even reach the front pew, she intercepted me. Her grip on my forearm was like a steel vise, her neatly manicured nails digging sharply into the fabric of my sleeve. She did not hug me. She did not offer a word of comfort. Instead, she dragged me into a shadowed alcove near the vestibule, away from the prying eyes of her social circle. Her voice was a venomous whisper, vibrating with suppressed rage. She looked me up and down, her eyes filled with absolute disgust. She told me that wearing a uniform to the funeral was a selfish, pathetic performance. She accused me of trying to steal the spotlight, of dragging my crude military life into her sacred, perfect day. She made it abundantly clear that this event was not allowed to revolve around me, my grief, or my service. It was her stage, and I had ruined the aesthetic. That alcove became the defining boundary line of our relationship. After they lowered my father into the ground, Evelyn moved with ruthless efficiency to consolidate her power. She seized total control of the family finances, the company narratives, and most importantly, the psychological environment of the household. I returned to my unit, and in my absence, she systematically dismantled my presence in the family. Her most successful campaign was waged against my younger brother, Luke. Luke was impressionable, soft-hearted, and desperately eager to please our mother. With my father gone and me stationed far away, Evelyn had unfettered access to his developing mind. She painted me as cold, distant, and uncaring. She told him my absence was a choice, a rejection of our family in favor of my government job. She did not just turn him against me, she taught him to pity me as someone who was broken and incapable of normal human connection. Over the years, I ceased to be a living, breathing sister to him. I became a cautionary tale, a void at the dinner table that Evelyn pointed to whenever she needed to illustrate her own endurance. But my father, for all his quiet complicity in my mother's social theater, had left a fail-safe behind. He understood the dynamics of his own house better than anyone realized. In his will, he did not leave his legacy to her unchecked discretion. He established a robust trust fund and allocated a commanding percentage of shares in his logistics firm directly to me. However, he attached a strict maturation clause to the inheritance. The assets were placed in a holding structure, managed under a fiduciary arrangement that Evelyn had managed to legally dominate in the interim. But the clause was absolute. Upon my 35th birthday, every single restriction would evaporate. On that day, I would assume sole, uncontested control over the trust and become the majority shareholder of his empire. My birthday was exactly 6 weeks away. Sitting in the quiet isolation of my home, turning the events of the past over in my mind, the cold reality of the situation finally crystallized. This was never about maternal concern. Evelyn did not care about my mental health, my sleep schedule, or my supposed trauma. She cared about the calendar. For years, she had enjoyed uncontested access to the resources my father left behind. She had used that wealth to fund her flawless lifestyle, to maintain her grip on my brother, and to project her power in our hometown. But the clock was running out. In less than 42 days, her legal authority over my inheritance would disintegrate. She would lose the financial leverage she had wielded like a weapon since the day of the funeral. The sudden accusations, the desperate attempt to label me medically incompetent, it was all a frantic, calculated blockade. She realized she could not stop the transfer of power through normal channels, so she decided to burn the bridge entirely. If she could convince a judge that I was unstable, the court would intervene, the transfer would be halted, and she could petition to remain in control indefinitely. She was trying to build a new cage for me before the old one unlocked. It was a brilliant, terrifying strategy, rooted in years of careful alienation. She had already convinced her friends, her church, and my own brother that I was a lost cause. Now, she just needed to convince the legal system. She thought my silence over the years was a sign of weakness, a proof that I would simply absorb this final, crushing blow. She thought I was the exact same girl she had cornered in the church alcove. She was entirely mistaken. I told my relatives I worked in government network infrastructure. It was a convenient, incredibly boring lie designed to kill any further questions. People hear the word infrastructure and their eyes instantly glaze over. They assume I spend my days crawling under metal desks to plug in loose cables, or perhaps sitting in a gray cubicle resetting forgotten passwords for low-level bureaucrats. I let them believe it. I encouraged it. The reality of my daily life was a ghost story. They were legally not cleared to hear. I am a captain attached to the Strategic Signal Defense Directorate. The Directorate does not exist on any public organizational charts. We do not have a recruiting website. We are the invisible, digital wall standing between critical military logistics and hostile state actors who want to watch those systems burn. My specific mandate is signal warfare and rapid system response. When an adversary attempts to hijack the encrypted frequencies controlling emergency ambulance dispatch, rapid response transport chains, or tactical field communications, my team is the one that hunts them down. We find the anomaly, isolate the threat, and sever the connection before the grid goes dark. We ensure the blood supply keeps moving when the world falls apart. 8 months before Evelyn filed her malicious petition, my unit faced an intrusion protocol that nearly brought 3 separate military installations to a grinding halt. The incident carried the highly classified designation of Iron Lantern. It started as a barely perceptible whisper in the global data flow. Automated medical supply drones, the heavy-duty units responsible for transporting critical surgical kits, anti-venom, and rare blood types across sprawling base perimeters, began deviating from their programmed flight paths. It was not a hard crash or an obvious hijacking. It was brilliant and insidious. The drones were slightly drifting, recalculating their routes based on phantom weather data injected into their navigation feeds. This caused them to delay their arrival times by crucial minutes, in a mass casualty scenario, or a surgical trauma unit waiting for a rare blood type. A delay of 5 minutes is an absolute death sentence. I took the point lead on the rapid analysis team. We locked down inside the sensitive compartmented information facility. The air inside the secure room is always brutally dry, and the overhead fluorescent lights hum with a high-frequency vibration that slowly burrows into your skull. For nearly 70 consecutive hours, I lived entirely on residual adrenaline, stale bottled water, and the singular, consuming obsession of finding the ghost hiding in the machine. I did not sleep. I barely blinked. I stared at cascading lines of raw telemetry, manually isolating every single data packet transmitting to the compromised drone fleets. The enemy code was a masterpiece of digital camouflage. They had not attacked the primary navigation systems directly. They had buried a highly sophisticated, spoofed command sequence deep inside routine maintenance update logs. It looked exactly like a harmless battery calibration ping, a piece of data so mundane that the automated security filters ignored it completely. But that tiny ping carried a parasitic payload that subtly altered the global positioning coordinates. I finally cracked the sequence at hour 68. I isolated the parasitic code, built a localized countermeasure patch, and purged the spoofed signals from the entire defense network. I watched the green indicators illuminate across the global situation map as all compromised transport drones corrected their headings and returned to their true flight paths. The threat was neutralized. But the human nervous system is not designed to run at maximum overclock for nearly 3 days straight without consequence. The moment the adrenaline evaporated, my body simply shut down. I did not have a psychotic break. I did not suffer a mental collapse or attempt to harm myself in any way. I experienced a catastrophic neurological failure. The sheer physical exhaustion, combined with the blinding aura of a post-traumatic migraine I had been aggressively ignoring for 2 days, triggered a massive grand mal seizure right there on the operations floor. Because my collapse was classified as a severe medical emergency rather than a kinetic combat wound, base medical protocol dictated I be transported immediately to the nearest Level 1 trauma center. That meant an ambulance ride to a civilian hospital located outside the wire. When the civilian neurologists and emergency room doctors treated me, they were operating completely blind. My commanding officers stripped my medical file of all operational context before handing it over to the civilian staff. The doctors did not know a single detail about Iron Lantern. They did not know about the 70 hours of unrelenting stress, the classified threat environment, or the immense weight of the lives depending on my keystrokes. They only saw a deeply exhausted woman who had suffered a violent seizure, presented with extreme light sensitivity, chronic insomnia, and underlying markers of combat-related post-traumatic stress. The discharge papers they printed out were a fragmented, terrifying snapshot of a broken brain, completely and utterly divorced from the reality of the mission that caused it. And that is exactly where I made the most catastrophic tactical error of my entire life. Years ago, before I fully understood the bottomless depth of my mother's malice, I had listed Evelyn as my primary civilian emergency contact. It was a piece of administrative paperwork I filled out as a junior officer and simply forgot to update as the years passed. When I woke up in that harsh, brightly lit civilian hospital bed, the damage was already permanent. The hospital administration had called her. They handed my mother a formal discharge summary filled with clinical terms like severe neurological event, acute trauma response, and profound sleep deprivation. They gave her the exact weapon she had been waiting for. Evelyn took that single piece of paper and built an entire fictitious universe around it. She transformed an honorable battle scar into a legal straitjacket. Once she possessed that medical vocabulary, she began systematically weaponizing my everyday life. Operating at the highest levels of signal defense permanently changes how you interact with the physical world. Operational security is not a switch you turn off when you leave the base. It becomes permanent muscle memory. Whenever I was forced to visit her house, I immediately placed my mobile phone inside a specialized signal-blocking pouch to prevent any unauthorized remote access or location tracking. I slept with heavy blackout curtains drawn tight against the window frames to mitigate my severe migraine triggers and ensure total visual darkness. Whenever I entered a new room, my eyes automatically scanned the corners, noting exits, blind spots, and sightlines out of deeply ingrained tactical habit. I absolutely refused to discuss the specifics of my workday with anyone, offering only vague, polite deflections when pressed. To a trained intelligence operative, these are standard, non-negotiable protocols for survival and career security. To Evelyn, they were the perfect theatrical props for her twisted narrative. She took my professional discipline and successfully rebranded it to the civilian world as clinical, dangerous paranoia. She sat in her pristine living room and told her high-priced lawyers and her church friends that the signal-blocking pouch was absolute proof I thought invisible assassins were tracking my movements. She claimed my biological need for a dark, quiet room was a symptom of a deep, crippling depression that left me unable to face the daylight. She presented my strict silence about my government job as undeniable proof that the job itself was a grandiose delusion. She took the very armor that allowed me to keep my country safe, painted it with the brush of insanity, and used it to convince a judge that I was no longer fit to govern my own existence. My mother did not launch her legal strike overnight. A woman like Evelyn understands that true destruction requires a fertile, carefully cultivated foundation. She began laying the psychological groundwork months in advance, weaving a tragic narrative through the affluent social circles of our hometown. During the leisurely Sunday brunches following church services, or over delicate porcelain teacups at her exclusive charity committee meetings, she would let out a perfectly measured sigh. When an acquaintance asked about her eldest child, her eyes would cloud with a practiced, luminous sorrow. She told her peers that conversing with me was like speaking to someone permanently trapped in a combat zone. She painted a vivid picture of a woman drowning in severe paranoia. Someone who clung to ridiculous secrets and could no longer tell the difference between mundane civilian life and a fabricated tactical fantasy. She never raised her voice to complain. She simply let the poison drip into the conversation, drop by agonizing drop, until everyone in her influential orbit pitied the poor, stoic matriarch, burdened by a deeply disturbed daughter. Once the social stage was set and the community narrative firmly established, she needed a legal architect to build the cage. She found her champion in Randall Pike. Pike was a high-end estate litigation attorney whose primary talent was taking the raw, ugly greed of warring families and dressing it up in the polite, sanitary language of the civil court system. When she first sat in his expansive mahogany-paneled office, Pike asked her to outline her primary objective. Most parents initiating a drastic medical hold would break down, express profound grief, and beg the lawyer to save their sick child. Evelyn did no such thing. Her voice remained entirely steady, her posture immaculate. She looked Pike dead in the eye and asked him exactly what legal mechanisms could be deployed to permanently prevent me from assuming control of the trust and the company shares on the specified maturation date. Pike was a highly shrewd man. He recognized the scent of hidden motives immediately. Before drafting a single document, he initiated a preliminary, internal review of the estate accounts to assess the battlefield he was stepping onto. What he found buried deep in the financial ledgers explained absolutely everything. The impending transfer of power was not just a loss of control for Evelyn, it was a looming criminal exposure. When the trust transitions to my control, the law mandates a comprehensive, independent financial audit of the preceding years to ensure the fiduciary acted in good faith. That audit would have been the equivalent of shining a police floodlight on a bloody crime scene. For years, Evelyn had been slowly, methodically bleeding my inheritance dry. She ran a boutique side business called Maple House Events. It was a vanity project focused on hosting lavish, egregiously overpriced galas at a sprawling historic property she had purchased. But the venue was a massive financial sinkhole. drowning under the weight of toxic real estate loans and exorbitant overhead costs. To keep her pristine image intact and her failing vanity project afloat, Evelyn had been secretly siphoning massive quarterly dividends directly from my protective trust. She disguised these illegal, self-serving withdrawals under incredibly vague and manipulative accounting categories. She labeled the stolen funds as ongoing family care expenses, property maintenance conducted for my eventual benefit, and preventative medical emergency reserves. She stole the substantial wealth my father built from the ground up to subsidize her own catastrophic business failures. She knew with absolute certainty that the moment I took the helm, the missing capital would be instantly flagged by any competent forensic accountant. To stop the audit, she had to stop the transfer. And to stop the transfer, she needed a medical executioner. She reached out through a shadowy network of legal and medical fixers to find a forensic psychiatrist whose clinical reputation carried undeniable heavy weight in a courtroom. She found Adrian Mercer. But Evelyn was a master of omitting the very truths that would dismantle her elaborate game. When she contracted his services, she presented him with a highly curated, entirely fictitious dossier. She told him I was a tragic case of civilian burnout, a woman who had experienced some minor, unspecified military trauma and subsequently suffered a complete, irreversible psychotic break. She spun a tale of a low-level, insignificant technician who coped with her incredibly mundane existence by inventing wild delusions of grandeur, pretending to hold a crucial top-secret role in national defense. She deliberately withheld every single piece of reality that could have shattered her story. She did not provide him with my actual military rank. She meticulously hid my true operational title. She conveniently failed to produce a single military performance evaluation, a fitness report, or any official document that would have immediately proven my high-level cognitive function and my highly classified security clearance. She handed a brilliant, analytical doctor a jigsaw puzzle with half the crucial pieces intentionally destroyed and burned, fully expecting him to build the exact twisted picture she wanted the judge to see. She assumed his civilian detachment would prevent him from digging deeper than the carefully fabricated paper trail she provided. But Evelyn also knew that medical opinions and aggressive legal maneuvering might not be enough to sway a cautious judge if the core family appeared divided. She needed a unified chorus of agreement to make the lie impenetrable, and she found her most tragic, useful pawn in my younger brother. Luke had always been incredibly pliable, a gentle soul perpetually caught in the heavy gravitational pull of our mother's domineering personality. She sat him down at the heavy oak dining table in the house we grew up in and delivered the final, fatal lie. She wept. She produced real, glistening tears, telling Luke that my mind was completely terrifyingly gone. She convinced him that if I were allowed to take control of the logistics firm in my current, highly unstable state, I would burn our father's legacy to the ground within a single month. She told him the company would inevitably go bankrupt, the loyal employees would lose their livelihoods, and the entire family would be left out on the street with absolutely nothing. She framed the vicious guardianship petition not as a hostile attack, but as a desperate, loving act of salvation. She told him that signing the supporting sworn affidavit was the one and only way to protect me from myself. Luke, utterly blind to the massive financial fraud happening behind closed doors and deeply terrified by the fake, out-of-context medical records she shoved across the table, believed every single word that fell from her mouth. He took the pen she offered. He signed his name on the dotted line, legally endorsing my total destruction without ever realizing he was handing the executioner the very rope meant for my neck. He thought he was saving the family, while our mother was simply using his signature to lock the door to my cage. Owen Hale was already waiting for me on the heavy stone steps of the Red Clay County Courthouse when I arrived. The morning air was sharp, biting at my face, but the cold felt entirely appropriate for the battlefield we were about to step onto. Hale held a thick leather briefcase, his posture radiating the tight, coiled energy of a man preparing for a frontal assault. We bypassed the standard civilian security lines, flashing our respective credentials, and moved swiftly toward a quiet, alcove briefing area tucked away on the second floor. He did not offer any empty reassurances or comforting platitudes. He operated strictly on tactical reality, which was exactly why I retained his services. He unclasped his briefcase and handed me a dense, heavily tabbed binder. He told me this was the finalized strike package Evelyn and her legal team had submitted to the judge just hours before the hearing. I opened the heavy cover and began to read. The sheer volume of the paperwork was staggering, a meticulously constructed labyrinth of legal maneuvering designed to trap me indefinitely. The emergency guardianship petition was merely the opening salvo. Hale directed my attention to a specific medical directive form buried in the middle of the stack. It was a durable power of attorney document. I stared at the signature line. The ink looked vaguely like my handwriting, but the dates were clearly smudged, slightly altered to suggest I had signed away my rights during a period of supposed extreme vulnerability. Beside it was a formal request submitted by Randall Pike demanding mandatory, heavily supervised psychiatric monitoring. And then came the financial anchor. Evelyn had revised her initial demands. She was no longer just asking to temporarily freeze the assets. She submitted a formal proposal to extend her total managerial control over the trust fund for another 3 years. 3 years of unchecked access. 3 years to hide her financial crimes. I turned the page and confronted my mother's sworn character affidavit. The words leaped off the crisp white paper, dripping with a manufactured, maternal sorrow. Evelyn wrote that I was a tragic, broken shell of a human being. She claimed I could not distinguish basic civilian duty from violent, heroic delusions. She stated, under the penalty of perjury, that I had entirely fabricated a high-stakes military career merely to cover up my profound psychological breakdown and my complete inability to cope with the real world. I closed the binder, the snap of the rings echoing sharply in the quiet alcove. Hale leaned against the marble wall, his eyes tracking the bustling courthouse corridor. He warned me that we were facing a highly precarious tactical disadvantage. The presiding judge was known for prioritizing conservative, risk-averse decisions when medical concerns were raised. Hale explained that if Pike and Evelyn successfully painted me as a highly intelligent but fundamentally unstable individual, the judge would likely take the path of least resistance. The court could easily decide to temporarily maintain the asset freeze and grant the requested 3 years of medical oversight out of an abundance of caution. A temporary order in this jurisdiction could take months or even years to overturn. We had to break their narrative completely and immediately, or the cage would lock around me. We walked out of the alcove and joined the slow, steady current of people moving toward the probate courtrooms. I maintained an unnerving, absolute calmness. My heart rate was a steady 60 beats per minute. My face was a smooth, unreadable mask. People in the corridor subtly stepped out of my way, sensing the cold, radiating intensity of my focus. I felt entirely prepared for the confrontation, right up until we rounded the final corner and approached the heavy oak doors of our designated courtroom. The opposing force was already gathered near the plaintiff's table just inside the hallway. I saw Evelyn first, adjusting the collar of her tailored jacket, looking every bit the affluent, deeply concerned matriarch. I saw Luke standing a few paces behind her, his eyes fixed firmly on his expensive leather shoes. I saw Randall Pike flipping confidently through his own binder, wearing the smug expression of a man who believed he had already won. And then I saw the man standing slightly apart from the rest of them. My forward momentum completely halted. The ambient noise of the courthouse faded into a dull, distant ringing. Adrian Mercer was standing in the corridor. He wore a sharp charcoal gray civilian suit, but the expensive fabric could not hide the distinct, rigid posture of a career military officer. The polished marble floors of the Virginia courthouse vanished from my mind, instantly replaced by the harsh, fluorescent lighting and the sharp scent of pine cleaner at Fort Calder. It was exactly 7 years ago. I was sitting in a windowless interrogation room, undergoing the most brutal, exhaustive psychological vetting process of my entire life. I was attempting to secure a billet with the elite network defense echelons. The final hurdle was the post-trauma psychological endurance evaluation unit. Adrian Mercer was the commanding officer of that specific unit. He was the man sitting across the metal table from me for 3 grueling days. He probed every single vulnerability in my mind. He analyzed my stress responses, my coping mechanisms, and my ability to process catastrophic failure. He pushed me to the absolute psychological brink to see if my mind would shatter under the weight of impossible decisions. I did not shatter. I adapted. At the end of the final evaluation, he closed my file, looked me dead in the eyes, and signed the operational clearance form. He was the one who handed me the keys to the highly classified world. I remembered the exact words he spoke before he dismissed me from the room. He told me that my capacity to maintain absolute precision under extreme pressure was not a pathology. He said it was a rarity. Standing in the courthouse hallway, a cold wave of genuine uncertainty washed over me. I had absolutely no idea whose side he was actually on today. Mercer was a forensic expert now, operating entirely in the civilian sector. His professional duty was to evaluate the evidence presented to him by the retaining attorneys. If Evelyn had successfully poisoned the well, if she had handed him a masterfully distorted medical file entirely stripped of my classified operational context, he might look at the skewed data and draw a fatal conclusion. A doctor, even a brilliant and experienced one, can only diagnose the symptoms described in the chart sitting in front of him. If he believed the carefully constructed lies Evelyn had fed him, his expert testimony would be the final nail in my coffin. He could destroy my life today without ever knowing he was looking at a fabricated map. The bailiff stepped out of the courtroom and announced in a booming voice that our docket number was being called. The heavy wooden doors swung open inward, revealing the austere, intimidating interior of the courtroom. The air inside felt heavy, thick with the crushing weight of impending judgment. I resumed my walking pace, moving step for step beside Owen Hale. As I crossed the threshold, the reality of the moment crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. This hearing was no longer just a legal dispute over corporate dividends or trust fund access. It was not merely a battle to unfreeze my bank accounts or salvage my public reputation in our small town. This was a war for the fundamental right to define my own existence. Evelyn wanted to legally rewrite my history, to completely erase my service, and to replace my identity with a fictional, broken version of a daughter she could comfortably control and exploit. I walked down the center aisle, my eyes locked on the elevated judge's bench, knowing with absolute certainty that I had to completely destroy her perfect story before it destroyed me. The courtroom was an imposing theater built of dark oak, polished brass, and heavy green velvet. Evelyn took her seat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a perfectly tailored dark blue suit that projected quiet, respectable authority. A single strand of luminescent pearls rested gently against her collarbone. She looked exactly like the woman she played flawlessly in her affluent social circles, a devoted, grieving mother pushed to the absolute brink by a tragedy she could not control. When the judge, an older woman with a stern face, signaled for the proceedings to begin, Evelyn let out a soft, meticulously measured exhale. It was a masterclass in calculated vulnerability. The air in the room instantly thickened, suffocating my side of the aisle. I realized with a cold clarity that we were not fighting facts today. We were fighting an aesthetic. Evelyn was selling a feeling, and the entire room was buying it. Randall Pike stood up, slowly buttoning his expensive tailored jacket. He did not yell or pound his fist on the table. He used a voice dripping with sympathetic condescension, which was far worse. He introduced me to the court not as a highly capable adult, but as a tragic, fragile casualty of mundane life. He told the judge that I was a former low-level technical employee who had suffered a routine, unfortunate workplace trauma many years ago. According to his deeply insulting narrative, my mind had fractured under the minor, everyday stresses of civilian employment, causing me to retreat into a bizarre, defensive shell. He claimed I was now hopelessly clinging to delusions of a top-secret military role, using these childish fantasies as a psychological shield against my own profound inadequacy and failure to launch a normal life. Every single word he spoke was a tiny surgical incision. Slowly slicing away my dignity in a public forum while I was forced to sit in absolute silence. Pike called Evelyn to the witness box. She walked with a slight, hesitant step, projecting the image of a woman carrying an unbearable burden across her shoulders. Once she placed her hand on the Bible and was sworn in. Her testimony flowed like a slow-acting poison. She described my rare visits to her home with horrifying inaccuracy. She told the court how I shoved my mobile devices into thick signal-blocking bags the exact moment I walked through the front door. She recounted how I relentlessly taped the edges of the guest room windows shut to block out the sunlight, and how I paced the hallways to check the locks on the front and back doors exactly 3 times every single night. She claimed I spoke in disjointed, encrypted bursts of jargon that no one in the family could possibly comprehend. She framed my deeply ingrained, absolutely necessary operational discipline as the erratic, terrifying behavior of a woman actively detaching from reality. Hearing my standard survival protocols twisted into symptoms of madness while court clerks and strangers looked on with pity was a unique, burning kind of public execution. I kept my face entirely blank, employing the emotional suppression techniques I used during interrogations, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Pike then handed her a thick stack of manila folders labeled as exhibits. Evelyn produced the fragmented medical files from my civilian hospital admission months ago. She laid out clear copies of my high-dosage prescriptions used strictly for severe migraine management. Then, she displayed large printed screenshots of text messages I had sent her during the agonizing, blinding peaks of those neurological episodes. They were short, clipped sentences, requesting silence, canceling plans, or stating I could not tolerate light, typed while my vision was completely blurred by pain. Evelyn read them aloud, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical timing, stopping to dab her eyes with a tissue. She did not describe a woman suffering from a debilitating physiological headache. She interpreted those brief, fragmented texts as undeniable, tragic proof of a rapid cognitive decline. She told the judge my brain was quite literally deteriorating, that I was losing my grasp on language and logic. I shifted my gaze away from the witness stand and looked toward the gallery. My younger brother sat in the second row. His shoulders were hunched, and his head was bowed so low he was staring directly at the wooden floorboards. He looked sick. Pike did not even need to put him on the stand to inflict maximum emotional damage. The lawyer simply picked up the sworn affidavit Luke had signed and read it directly into the court record, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. Hearing my own brother's words weaponized against me was devastating. The statement confirmed every single lie Evelyn had spun. The document declared that I was no longer myself, that I had returned from my supposed minor service entirely broken, and that I was completely incapable of functioning safely in society. Luke never looked up to meet my eyes. He just sat there, acting as the final damning character witness in a trial explicitly meant to erase my autonomy. Owen Hale shot to his feet, the legs of his wooden chair scraping loudly against the floor. His voice cut sharply through the manufactured sorrow filling the room. He formally and aggressively objected to the gross mischaracterization of the medical documents. He argued that Pike and Evelyn were making wild, entirely unqualified psychiatric leaps based entirely on fragmented civilian emergency room records and out-of-context, private text messages. He demanded the court stop allowing a layperson to diagnose complex neurological events from a witness stand, but the judge simply adjusted her reading glasses, looked down at the documents, and overruled the objection. The ruling felt like a physical blow to the chest. The court allowed the humiliating testimony to continue because Evelyn's narrative was simply too neat, too logical, and far too compelling. It was exactly the kind of tragic, digestible family drama the legal system was conditioned to believe. A distressed, loving mother, a supportive, concerned brother, and a defiant, uncooperative daughter made for a perfectly packaged story that required no complex thinking. Sensing the momentum was entirely on his side, Pike moved in for the final, lethal strike. He pivoted smoothly away from the medical accusations and addressed the massive financial core of the petition. He raised his hands, gesturing toward the imaginary weight of the impending trust fund transfer. He warned the judge that in exactly 6 weeks, I was scheduled to receive unchecked, total control over a massive accumulation of wealth and a functioning, highly valuable emergency logistics corporate entity. He lowered his voice to a grave whisper, making the entire room lean forward to listen. He declared that handing millions of dollars and a vital supply chain company to a woman who was actively losing her capacity for self-control was the most dangerous, irresponsible situation the court could possibly allow. He framed the permanent guardianship not as a restriction of my rights, but as a desperately needed rescue mission to save me from ruining my own life and destroying my father's legacy. Pike returned to the plaintiff's table, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He looked over at our side of the room with the supreme, arrogant confidence of a chess player who had just trapped the opposing king in a corner. He had painted the picture perfectly. He had established the initial trauma, the bizarre behavior, the cognitive decline, and the urgent, catastrophic financial risk. He had built a flawless cage of lies. He needed only one final, authoritative medical voice to seal the tomb shut forever. He turned his attention back to the bench, smoothed the lapels of his immaculate suit, and announced his next move. "The plaintiff calls its primary psychiatric expert to the stand," he declared, his voice ringing clearly across the silent room. "Dr. Adrian Mercer." Adrian Mercer stood up from the heavy wooden bench in the gallery. He did not walk like a highly paid civilian medical expert, preparing to offer a subjective, malleable opinion to a civilian judge. He moved with the heavy, measured cadence of a man who had spent his entire adult life issuing absolute commands in environments where debate was not permitted. His charcoal suit was immaculately tailored, but it could not hide the rigid, squared set of his shoulders or the predatory stillness of his gaze. His face was entirely unreadable. As he crossed the space between the gallery and the witness stand, there was no subtle nod of reassurance toward my mother, nor was there any glint of recognition directed at me. He was a closed vault. He stepped into the witness box, remaining standing until the bailiff administered the oath. He swore to tell the truth with a voice that was low, resonant, and entirely devoid of nerves. He sat down, adjusting the microphone in front of him with a single, precise movement. Randall Pike approached the podium with the swagger of a victor about to claim his spoils. He spent the first 10 minutes meticulously walking through Mercer's extensive, intimidating credentials. Pike wanted the court to hear every single detail of the doctor's brilliance. He listed the 2 decades of psychiatric practice, the high-profile forensic evaluations conducted for federal courts, and the specialized expertise in severe trauma analysis. Mercer confirmed each credential with a single, clipped word: yes, correct, affirmative. Pike was practically glowing, completely oblivious to the fact that he was building a massive, unassailable pedestal for the very man who was about to drop an anvil on his case. With the foundation of absolute authority established, Pike leaned forward, placing his hands on the edges of the podium. He prepared to ask the ultimate, damning question. He opened his mouth to ask Mercer for his professional, binding medical opinion regarding my supposed total cognitive collapse. Before Pike could form the first syllable, Mercer raised his right hand. It was a slight gesture, but it carried enough quiet authority to freeze the lawyer mid-breath. "Your Honor," Mercer said, his voice easily commanding the cavernous room. "Before I offer my formal forensic conclusion based on the incomplete file provided to me by the plaintiff's counsel, I respectfully request the court's permission to ask the subject one direct question." The courtroom fell into a state of absolute, suspended animation. Randall Pike looked slightly confused but quickly recovered, offering a gracious nod. Evelyn shifted in her seat, a faint, anticipating gleam lighting up her eyes. She clearly thought this was the final theatrical trap. She assumed Mercer, the brilliant forensic psychiatrist, was going to ask me a complex, deeply triggering question designed to make me unravel publicly. She expected me to babble, to freeze, or to launch into the paranoid, defensive rant she had so carefully warned the judge about. The judge, intrigued by the highly unusual break in standard protocol, adjusted her glasses and granted the request. Mercer turned his head slowly. He bypassed the lawyers, bypassed my mother, and locked his eyes directly onto mine. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "Captain Butler," he said. The two words echoed off the high oak walls like a gunshot. The entire plaintiff's table flinched. Evelyn's perfectly maintained posture slipped, her spine stiffening as a visible wave of confusion washed over her face. She had never heard a single living soul address her daughter with a military title. To her, I was just a broken IT worker. The judge frowned, looking down at the legal filings in front of her, searching for a title that had been deliberately omitted from every single page Evelyn had submitted. Mercer did not wait for the shock to settle. He delivered his question with razor-sharp precision. "Regarding the incident that resulted in your hospitalization and subsequent neurological event," he began, his tone entirely clinical. "What specific operational environment were you navigating? And what were the exact parameters of the threat you were managing when the physiological failure occurred?" He was speaking to me not as a patient, but as a subordinate officer offering a situational report. I did not hesitate. I did not look at my mother or her lawyer. I kept my eyes locked on Mercer and answered with a voice that was perfectly level, stripped of all emotion, delivering the exact data he requested without breaching classified boundaries. "Sir," I replied, the words slipping out with ingrained, automatic respect. I was acting as the point lead on a rapid analysis team. We were engaged in a continuous, 70-hour crisis response protocol. I was actively tracking and isolating a hostile, spoofed command sequence that had successfully penetrated the navigational telemetry of decentralized medical transport fleets across 3 separate installations. My team was required to manually rewrite the routing protocols and restore the emergency triage signal lines. I remained at my station without sleep for nearly 3 full days until the network integrity was absolutely verified and the transport routes were secured. The physical collapse occurred 90 seconds after the threat was neutralized. I stopped speaking. The silence that followed was suffocating. I had not sounded crazy. I had not sounded paranoid. I had sounded exactly like a highly trained specialist delivering a post-action debriefing. Mercer held my gaze for a fraction of a second longer, acknowledging the answer, before turning his head back to face the judge. "Your Honor," Mercer said, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding certainty. The vocabulary the subject just utilized in this courtroom: decentralized medical triage, navigational telemetry, spoofed command sequences is highly specific, advanced operational terminology. It does not exist in the fragmented civilian hospital records provided to me by the plaintiff's attorney. Furthermore, it is not the type of language a civilian suffering from delusions of grandeur simply picks up from the internet to fake a career. That is the exact, precise language of a senior officer operating within the Strategic Signal Defense Directorate. Pike gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles turning completely white. "Objection," he stammered, his voice suddenly sounding thin and reedy. "The witness is making sweeping factual assumptions outside his medical purview." "The witness is stating a professional fact," Mercer countered instantly, cutting Pike down with effortless authority. He looked directly at the judge, ignoring the sputtering lawyer entirely. "Your Honor, the plaintiff retained me assuming I was merely a civilian forensic expert. They were unaware of my prior military service. 7 years ago, I was the commanding officer of the Specialized Psychological Endurance and Threat Assessment Unit at Fort Calder." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Evelyn physically recoiled, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. The pearls around her neck suddenly looked like a chokehold. "I know, Captain Butler," Mercer continued, his voice echoing with devastating finality, "because I am the officer who personally administered her final psychological vetting. I am the man who signed the highly classified clearance documents confirming she possessed the exceptional mental fortitude required to enter that specific, grueling operational program. I tested her mind to its absolute limits, and I found her to be remarkably resilient." The judge leaned forward, her eyes wide, completely captivated by the total destruction of the plaintiff's narrative. "Based on my prior professional knowledge of the subject and the reality of her actual career," Mercer stated, shifting smoothly into his forensic conclusion, The medical dossier provided to me by Evelyn Butler is catastrophically misleading. It was stripped of all necessary operational context. The behaviors described by the plaintiff, keeping communication devices secure, maintaining strict environmental control over lighting, refusing to discuss her daily activities are not symptoms of a paranoid delusion. They are mandatory, standard operating procedures for an intelligence officer holding her level of clearance. Mercer placed his hands flat on the wooden railing of the witness box, delivering the final, crushing blow. Captain Butler did not suffer a psychotic break. He declared, "She suffered a severe physiological crash due to extreme sleep deprivation and immense neurological stress while protecting critical infrastructure." What the plaintiff has attempted to label as deep mental incompetence is, in medical and tactical reality, the biological limit of a highly capable human being pushed to the absolute edge of her endurance. In my expert medical opinion, Valerie Butler is in full possession of her faculties, and the petition before this court is entirely without medical merit. Owen Hale did not give the opposing counsel a single second to recover. The echo of Mercer's devastating conclusion was still ringing off the heavy oak walls when my attorney moved. He stepped out from behind our table, carrying a slender, unmarked gray folder he had kept deliberately hidden beneath his legal pads for the entirety of the morning. He did not ask for permission to speak. He simply commanded the space. He approached the bench and handed a notarized document to the court clerk. "Your Honor," Hale said, his voice stripped of any theatrical warmth, functioning instead like a scalpel. "Now that the medical foundation of this petition has been thoroughly dismantled by their own expert witness, I submit into evidence Defense Exhibit A. This is the finalized, legally binding maturation schedule for the Thomas Butler Generation Skipping Trust." The judge peered over her reading glasses, scanning the single sheet of paper. Hale did not wait for her to ask. He laid the trap bare for the entire room to see. "As the document clearly states," Hale continued, pacing slowly in front of the plaintiff's table, "my client assumes absolute, uncontested control over the entirety of the trust corpus and the controlling corporate shares in exactly 6 weeks, upon her 35th birthday. For the past decade, the petitioner has operated as the sole financial fiduciary. The moment the clock strikes midnight in exactly 42 days, her access is permanently revoked, and a mandatory, independent financial audit of the preceding decade is automatically triggered." Pike tried to stand, his face flushed a deep, mottled red. "Objection," he stammered, his voice lacking its previous polished relevance. "We are here to discuss medical capacity, not estate planning timelines." The judge did not even look at him. "Overruled," she snapped, her eyes narrowing as she read the schedule. "Proceed. Mr. Hale." Hale turned his back to Pike and pulled a thick, bound stack of banking ledgers from his portfolio. He dropped it onto the evidence podium with a heavy, satisfying thud. "If the court is looking for a motive behind this sudden, emergency petition," Hale said, "we need only look at where the dividends have been flowing. I am submitting 5 years of forensic banking statements. They illustrate a distinct, undeniable pattern. Every single financial quarter, substantial sums of capital ranging from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars were quietly siphoned from my client's protected accounts." Evelyn shifted violently in her chair. The immaculate posture she had maintained all morning began to fracture. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her breathing turning shallow and rapid. "These funds were not utilized for my client's medical care or property maintenance," Hale stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "The routing numbers match a private, limited liability corporation called Maple House Events, a deeply insolvent vanity business entirely owned and operated by Evelyn Butler. She is not trying to protect her daughter, Your Honor. She is trying to build a permanent dam to prevent an audit that will expose years of gross financial malfeasance." The courtroom air grew suffocatingly dense. The narrative of the weeping, desperate mother was burning to the ground in real time. Pike, desperate to regain any semblance of control, scrambled to redirect the focus back to the medical accusations. He pointed a trembling finger at the witness stand, where Adrian Mercer still sat with absolute, stone-faced composure. "Your Honor," Pike argued, raising his voice to a near shout. "Financial audits aside, we submitted physical evidence of erratic behavior, the isolation, the obsessive checking of exits, the refusal to communicate normally. A person can be a capable professional and still lose their grip on civil reality. The capacity to hold a job does not equal the capacity to manage a vast estate safely." Mercer leaned toward his microphone. He did not wait for the judge to ask for his input. He simply took the floor, utilizing the undeniable authority of his expertise. "Counselor," Mercer said, his tone chillingly polite, "you are attempting to conflate an acute stress response and highly trained threat mitigation with legal incapacity. They are not the same universe. When a covert operative enters a civilian environment, they do not simply turn off their training. Controlling communication devices, mapping exits, and minimizing information bleed are not signs of a fractured mind. They are the exact behavioral metrics of a highly functioning intelligence officer maintaining operational security. To diagnose those specific survival traits as paranoia is not just medically incorrect. It is clinical malpractice." Hale seized the opening instantly. He retrieved another stack of papers, this one containing the printed text messages and emails Evelyn had submitted earlier as proof of my supposed cognitive decline. He placed them side by side on the overhead projector for the judge to see. "Let us examine the plaintiff's physical evidence," Hale said. He tapped the projection screen. "The petitioner submitted these disjointed, fragmented messages to prove my client was losing her grasp on language, but my team ran a standard metadata extraction on the original digital files." He overlaid a new document on the screen, highlighting glaring discrepancies in bright yellow ink. These messages were aggressively spliced. Hale declared, "The petitioner took a sentence my client sent on a Tuesday evening regarding a severe migraine aura, cut it in half, and digitally stitched it to a completely unrelated reply sent 3 weeks later on a Sunday morning. She deliberately manufactured a digital paper trail to make brief, exhausted replies following 70-hour classified shifts look like the ramblings of a broken mind. This is not medical evidence. This is textbook forgery." That was the exact moment Evelyn finally shattered. The polished, tragic matriarch vanished completely. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands flat onto the heavy wooden table, the sound echoing sharply like a rifle crack. "That is an absolute lie," Evelyn hissed. Her voice was shrill, entirely devoid of the soft, practiced sorrow she had used just an hour prior. She glared at Hale with unfiltered, venomous hatred, then whipped her head toward the bench. "You are not listening to me. You are letting them twist everything. She is sick. She has always been sick and ungrateful. I am the only one who knows how to handle the family affairs. She will ruin everything we built." The judge slammed her gavel down, the sharp crack cutting through Evelyn's escalating tirade. "Order," the judge barked, her voice carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. "You will not speak out of turn in my courtroom, Mrs. Butler." Evelyn clamped her mouth shut, but her chest was heaving. Her face was flushed, her jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched. She looked around the room, visibly enraged that the audience, the lawyers, and the judge were no longer buying her performance. She expected total obedience, and she was receiving intense, forensic scrutiny. The judge slowly took off her reading glasses. She folded them and placed them deliberately on the bench. She looked down at Evelyn, the judicial neutrality in her eyes entirely replaced by a cold, hardened suspicion. "Mrs. Butler," the judge said, her tone dangerously quiet, "you came into my courtroom requesting the most severe restriction of human liberty this legal body can grant. You asked me to permanently strip your daughter of her fundamental autonomy. You stood under oath and claimed you were motivated entirely by a desperate, maternal need to protect her from her own failing mind." The judge picked up the massive binder Evelyn had submitted that morning and let it drop heavily back onto the desk. "Yet," the judge continued, her words landing like physical blows, "in this extensive, meticulously prepared filing, You failed to include a single military performance evaluation. You omitted her actual rank. You entirely erased her highly classified security clearance and her current operational command structure. If your sole, pure intention was to secure the best possible medical and legal protection for your child, why did you systematically hide the reality of her entire adult life from this court and from your own retained medical expert? Evelyn opened her mouth, but for the first time in her life, she had absolutely no engineered lie ready to deploy. The silence that filled the courtroom was absolute and crushing. The atmosphere in the room had completely inverted. We had walked in as the defensive party, desperately trying to fend off a medical execution. Now, the walls were closing in on the executioner. The tragic tale of a devoted mother trying to save her broken daughter had evaporated into thin air. In its place stood the ugly, undeniable reality of a massive, calculated financial fraud, dressed up in the stolen, weaponized language of mental health care. Evelyn had built a perfect cage of lies, but the paper trail had just handed us the match to burn it all down. The presiding judge struck her gavel against the sounding block, the sharp crack echoing through the heavy oak chamber. She announced a brief 15-minute recess to personally review the financial discrepancies Owen Hale had just dumped onto her desk. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, spilling the tense, suffocating atmosphere out into the expansive marble corridor. I walked out alongside Hale, keeping my posture entirely rigid, my facial expression locked in the same unreadable mask I utilized during hostile interrogations. I expected my mother to immediately retreat into a private consultation room with Randall Pike to frantically strategize her next fabricated narrative. Instead, the established battle lines suddenly fractured. A figure broke away from the plaintiff's side of the hallway. It was my younger brother. Luke did not walk toward our mother. He walked directly toward Owen Hale. His physical appearance was alarming. His face was entirely drained of color, possessing the waxy, translucent pallor of someone who had just survived a severe physical trauma. His hands were trembling so violently, he had to forcefully clasp them together in front of his belt buckle just to maintain the illusion of stillness. The polished, compliant son Evelyn had paraded into the courtroom an hour ago was completely gone. In his place stood a young man whose entire fabricated reality had just been violently shattered by two simple words spoken by Adrian Mercer. Captain Butler. Luke stopped a few feet away from us. He looked at me, truly looked at me. For the first time in nearly a decade, he did not see the broken, paranoid ghost our mother had meticulously painted for him. He saw the reality of the uniform I did not even have to wear to command respect. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat, and then he turned his eyes to my attorney. I never saw it. Luke whispered. His voice was cracked, raw, and barely audible over the ambient noise of the bustling courthouse corridor. Hale stepped forward, his tactical instincts instantly recognizing a critical defection. You never saw what, Luke? Hale asked, his tone carefully neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. I never saw her lose her mind. Luke confessed, the words spilling out of him like blood from an unbandaged wound. I never actually saw Valerie scream at shadows or hide from the sunlight. I never witnessed a single one of those psychotic episodes I swore to in that affidavit. Every single terrifying detail I wrote down was just a story our mother repeated to me. She said it over and over, every single day for years, until I truly believed it was my own memory. She made me believe my sister was a danger to herself. I remained completely silent, letting the heavy truth hang in the cold air between us. Luke squeezed his trembling hands tighter together. She cornered me in the kitchen 2 months ago. Luke continued, his breathing becoming shallow and frantic. She handed me a thick stack of legal documents. She was crying. She told me I had to sign them immediately, just to keep our father's logistics company safe until Valerie was mentally stable enough to handle the stress of the corporate transition. She told me it was just a temporary protective measure. Luke looked down at the marble floor, a profound, sickening guilt washing over his pale features. There were blank pages, he admitted, the confession sealing his own complicity in the fraud. The last 3 pages of the packet, the ones detailing the specific medical accusations and the permanent guardianship request, they were entirely blank when she handed me the pen. I signed empty paper because she told me she would fill in the standard corporate boilerplate language later. I did not know I was helping her build a prison. Hale did not offer absolution. He was a defense attorney, and he recognized the absolute legal goldmine standing in front of him. "What else do you have?" Hale demanded quietly. Luke reached a shaking hand into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a slightly faded, heavy manila envelope. The edges were worn, suggesting it had been hidden away and handled multiple times over the past few weeks. "I was packing up some of the old filing cabinets in our father's original corporate office last month," Luke explained, extending the envelope toward Hale. "Mom told me to shred everything prior to 5 years ago. Said it was just taking up space. But I found this tucked behind a drawer. I did not know what it meant, but the numbers looked wrong. I kept it. I do not know why, but I just could not put it in the shredder." Hale took the envelope, broke the old adhesive seal, and slid the contents out into the palm of his hand. I glanced over his shoulder. It was a photocopy of an internal accounting ledger, kept entirely separate from the official corporate books. Attached to the front of the ledger was a handwritten sticky note penned by my father's original, deeply loyal chief accountant. The note detailed a series of highly irregular, aggressive disbursement requests that Evelyn had personally forced through the system. The accountant had specifically documented that Evelyn demanded these massive withdrawals be logged directly against my protected asset column, explicitly bypassing the standard trust authorization protocols. Hale slid the papers back into the envelope. The corners of his mouth twitched upward into a cold, predatory smile. He looked at Luke. "Are you prepared to tell the judge exactly what you just told me?" Hale asked. Luke looked at me one final time. The fear in his eyes was entirely replaced by a desperate, agonizing need to correct the catastrophic damage he had helped inflict. He gave a single, firm nod. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and the bailiff announced that the court was back in session. We filed back into the grand chamber. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The judge took her seat at the elevated bench, her face set in a mask of rigid, unforgiving judicial authority. Randall Pike stood up at the plaintiff's table, nervously adjusting his silk tie, entirely unaware that his primary supporting witness had just handed the executioner's axe to the defense. Before Pike could utter a single syllable to resume his fabricated narrative, Luke stood up from his seat in the second row of the gallery. "Your Honor," Luke called out, his voice shaking but carrying clearly across the silent room. The judge frowned, looking past the attorneys to the young man standing amidst the heavy wooden benches. "Yes, Mr. Butler? What is the meaning of this interruption?" "I need to formally amend my sworn statement," Luke declared. He stepped out of the row and walked slowly down the center aisle, stopping just behind the low wooden railing that separated the gallery from the legal floor. Pike whipped his head around, his eyes widening in absolute horror. Evelyn froze, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the plaintiff table so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. "Proceed," the judge commanded, ignoring Pike's desperate, frantic attempts to object. Luke did not look at the lawyer. He spoke directly to the bench, delivering his words with a cracked, raw honesty that instantly obliterated all the sterile legal maneuvering that had dominated the morning. "Everything in my affidavit regarding my sister's mental state is a complete fabrication," Luke stated, the truth finally breaking free. "I have never seen Valerie lose control. She was always the quietest person in our house, but she was also the most solid. When our father died, she was the only one holding the roof up. The only person who has ever relentlessly called her unstable, the only person who constantly told me she was dangerous and broken, is my mother. She had me sign blank signature pages to secure my endorsement for this petition." The courtroom descended into a state of stunned, absolute silence. Evelyn could not handle the betrayal. Her ultimate pawn, the son she had molded and manipulated for years, was publicly walking off the board and burning her strategy to the ground. She spun around in her chair, entirely abandoning the carefully constructed facade of the weeping, desperate matriarch, her face contorted into a mask of vicious, ugly rage. She pointed a trembling finger directly at her son's chest. "Sit down and shut your mouth," Evelyn snapped, her voice shrill and echoing harshly against the oak walls. "Do not ruin everything just because you do not understand how adult matters work." The words hung in the air, a fatal, undeniable self-incrimination. The entire room collectively realized the horrifying truth. Evelyn Butler was not sitting in this courtroom terrified for her daughter's deteriorating health. She was terrified for her plan. She was terrified of losing the money. The judge stared at Evelyn with a look of profound, chilling disgust. She struck her gavel once, silencing the plaintiff completely. "Mr. Hale," the judge said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register as she shifted her attention back to my attorney. "Do you have any additional documentation to support this young man's highly disturbing revelation?" Hale stepped forward, carrying the faded manila envelope Luke had given him in the hallway. "I do, Your Honor," Hale replied smoothly. "I ask the court to accept Defense Exhibit B into evidence." These are internal accounting ledgers recovered directly from the original corporate archives, further detailing the unauthorized financial diversions from my client's protected estate. The judge nodded, extending her hand to receive the documents from the bailiff. The battle of subjective, emotional narratives was officially terminated. We were no longer arguing about my mental capacity or the definition of trauma. We had crossed the threshold into the lethal, unforgiving realm of hard, documented reality, written in ink, verified by signatures, and backed by undeniable financial ledgers. The trap Evelyn had spent years building had just violently snapped shut on her own wrists. The manila envelope Luke had handed over contained more than just the damning internal ledgers. As the judge meticulously reviewed the financial discrepancies, Owen Hale approached the bench once more, pulling a single, yellowed sheet of heavy stock paper from the very back of the stack. It bore the embossed seal of my late father's original corporate law firm, dated almost exactly 10 years ago. My father, Thomas Butler, was a man who planned for every conceivable logistical failure. He understood the structural weaknesses of supply chains, but more importantly, he understood the structural weaknesses of the people living under his own roof. "Your Honor," Hale announced, his voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the courtroom. "Within the records provided by the brother of my client, we have uncovered a formalized memorandum of intent, executed by the late Thomas Butler and witnessed by his corporate counsel. He explicitly anticipated this exact scenario." Hale turned to face Evelyn. She looked like a woman standing on a trapdoor, waiting for the lever to be pulled. "The memorandum stipulates a highly specific poison pill clause built directly into the foundational framework of the Generations Skipping Trust," Hale continued, projecting his voice so every word hammered into the opposing table. "My father mandated that if any party acting as the fiduciary attempts to initiate a competency or guardianship proceeding against Valerie Butler prior to the exact date of the asset transfer, their managerial authority is instantly and automatically suspended." Pike sat frozen, staring blankly at his own legal pads. He did not object. He did not even blink. "Furthermore," Hale stated, pulling a fresh, brightly lit tablet from his briefcase and placing it on the evidence podium, "that specific legal trigger mandates an immediate, independent forensic audit of all trust activities. Knowing this clause existed, I had my firm's forensic accounting team run a preliminary reconciliation of the ledgers. Mr. Butler provided during the recess. The results were transmitted to me 3 minutes ago." The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with intense scrutiny. "What are the preliminary findings, Mr. Hale?" "Over the past 7 years, Evelyn Butler has engaged in massive, unauthorized cross-collateralization," Hale declared, delivering the fatal blow. "She utilized the protective trust as a slush fund to prop up her failing real estate ventures. The preliminary estimate of misappropriated capital exceeds $2 million, disguised entirely through fraudulent invoices and fake familial care expenses." The air vanished from the room. Evelyn's face turned a horrifying shade of ashen gray. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles stark white, completely unable to form a single syllable of defense. The pious, sacrificing mother was dead. In her place sat an exposed embezzler, Adrian Mercer, still seated in the witness box, leaned toward the microphone. He did not need to wait for a question. The medical and legal realities had perfectly converged. "Your Honor," Mercer said, his voice carrying the final, unyielding weight of absolute authority. To summarize my forensic evaluation for the court record, Captain Valerie Butler is a highly capable, exceptionally resilient individual currently serving her country in an environment of extreme psychological pressure. She manages her combat-related trauma with absolute professional discipline. To attach a label of legal incompetence to this woman is not just a gross medical inaccuracy. Given the financial revelations presented today, it is overwhelmingly evident that the medical diagnosis was intentionally manipulated and maliciously directed to facilitate financial fraud. The judge sat back in her high leather chair. She looked at Evelyn, then at Randall Pike, and finally at me. The rigid, unforgiving mask of judicial authority settled firmly over her features. She picked up her wooden gavel. "This court has heard enough," the judge announced, her voice echoing with the crushing power of absolute judgment. "The petition for emergency and permanent guardianship is dismissed in its entirety, with prejudice. This court will not be weaponized to facilitate the theft of a generational estate." She turned her piercing gaze directly onto Evelyn. "I am ordering the immediate unfreezing of all accounts associated with Valerie Butler. Evelyn Butler, your authority as fiduciary is permanently terminated as of this exact second. Furthermore, based on the documented evidence of systemic financial malfeasance and the deliberate submission of forged digital communications, I am forwarding this entire case file, unredacted, to the County Financial Crimes Division for criminal investigation." The gavel slammed down. The sound was deafening. A sharp, definitive crack that severed the chains my mother had spent a decade forging. Randall Pike slowly closed his heavy binder. He looked physically ill. He realized, with crushing professional clarity, that he had not been hired to save a family. He had been manipulated into acting as the legal architect for a massive, immoral asset grab. He stood up, avoiding Evelyn's eyes entirely, and muttered to the court clerk that he would be filing a formal motion to withdraw as her legal representation immediately following the adjournment. Evelyn sat paralyzed in her chair. The immaculate, untouchable fortress she had built around herself had completely disintegrated in less than 2 hours. Her social standing, her stolen wealth, and her absolute control were gone, replaced by the very real, impending threat of a criminal indictment. I stood up from the defense table. I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming rush of emotional euphoria that people often expect in these moments. I felt the clean, sharp satisfaction of a neutralized threat. I buttoned my suit jacket and walked slowly toward the center aisle. I stopped exactly 1 foot away from where my mother was sitting. She finally looked up at me. Her eyes were wide, filled with a frantic, desperate realization that she had completely miscalculated the woman standing in front of her. I looked down at her and spoke my final piece. My voice was low, steady, and completely devoid of the anger she desperately wanted to see. "You mistook my silence for weakness," I said quietly, ensuring she heard every single syllable, "and you mistook control for love." I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on her and walked toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. Luke was waiting in the hallway. He was leaning heavily against the cold marble wall, looking completely shattered by the reality of what our family had become. When I approached, he stood up straight, his eyes searching my face for any sign of immediate forgiveness. I stopped in front of him. I did not pull him into a warm, cinematic embrace. The betrayal ran far too deep, and the wounds were far too fresh for that kind of artificial closure. But I also recognized that he was the one who ultimately handed me the sword to cut the final knot. "The truth you told today does not fix the past 10 years. I told him, my tone even and honest. "You let her use you. but walking into that courtroom and breaking her narrative was the first necessary condition. It is the only reason there might be a day, far down the line, when we can sit across from each other and actually speak like a family again. Luke nodded, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. He understood the boundary. He accepted it. I walked out of the red clay county courthouse and stepped into the crisp, biting afternoon air. The sky above Virginia was a brilliant, unclouded blue. Tomorrow, I would drive back to the windowless sub-basement of the Raven Annex. I would sit down at my secure terminal, surrounded by the humming servers and the quiet, relentless pressure of the network defense grid. But I would be doing it strictly on my own terms. I had not just secured my financial future, I had ruthlessly defended the honor of my service and reclaimed absolute ownership of my own name. The wall of lies Evelyn had meticulously constructed had collapsed precisely on the day she thought she had finally won. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and please leave a comment down below letting me know where in the world you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, I would love to invite you to subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by pressing the hype button so that this story can be heard by even more people.